Do you ever worry you're on the wrong side of history because you're consistently siding with and defending bullies?
Yeah, I'll tell you what happens. People like you, Skyler, only ever watch the videos that are supporting the speech of people you don't like, and you ignore it when I make videos defending the speech of people on your side because it's not sensational enough for you.
I'm not super familiar with your videos. It doesn't show up in my suggested feed.
Devil's Advocate
with Skyler Turden. All right, welcome to this week's installment of Devil's Advocate. I'm your host, Skyler Turden. Today on the show, we have a man, you can follow him on YouTube. It's Tim Cast. He's been talking a lot about big tech. That's been the topic of the day. Censorship, as it's called from those on the right. So yeah, we'll get into all of it and do kind of a deep dive. Mr. Tim Pool, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Skyler.
Well, I'm glad to have you on. First off, I want to make sure I don't misrepresent you. Where do you consider yourself as far as lining up politically?
Moderate, center-leftish.
Okay.
Middle, yes.
So center-leftist, moderate, would you like Dave Rubin or,
To the left of Rubin, yeah. So not as far as Bernie Sanders, but I definitely liked Bernie, in 2016.
Okay. Well, that might come as a surprise to a lot of people, obviously, because you've sort of been the biggest champion of, I don't know if people would call it sort of new regulations or a new way of looking at big tech and what you claim is sort of a monopoly on speech, particularly Facebook, YouTube. You were on Joe Rogan's program recently. So let me ask you this. I guess let's start with this. YouTube, right? First, let me ask you. Let me let you speak in your own words. Why do you have a problem with the current practices of social media?
Well, if one side is being removed from the conversation by a massive multi-billion-dollar national corporation with no accountability, then our society is going to be dictated by small. Well, it's very simple. Mark Zuckerberg is not the president of the United States, nor is Sundar Pichai. But they are certainly exercising international ideas over Americans. So if these big tech companies can't be held to account if they dominate the market. If they restrict legal speech, you're going to end up with a repressive, technocratic, fascistic government. I don't think anybody wants that, right? So, we want to address it before it gets too bad, and it's already pretty bad.
Wow, there was a lot of adjectives there. Color me impressed. Let me ask you this. I would imagine that stems from obviously being more classical liberal. This idea of you being anti-censorship would be pro-freedom, pro-liberty to an extent.
Oh, yeah.
So then let me ask you this. Why should YouTube, a private company, be forced to carry someone on their platform? For example, recently there was we'll get into that Vox with Carlos Mazza and Stephen Crowder. Why should YouTube be forced to act as a mouthpiece? Why all of a sudden when it comes to private companies like YouTube are you looking for big government regulation?
It depends on scale. And, a lot of these issues with free speech there's a nuance here, right? It's not necessarily that every single platform, everywhere, every single time should be forced to carry speech. But YouTube's definitely dominated online video in terms of user-generated content. There's no other game in town. Sure, Vimeo kind of exists, but through various business practices, YouTube has come out on top. So if you really want to reach people and have your voice be heard or allow people to actually subscribe and follow your content, whether or not YouTube promotes it, YouTube is where you have to be. So because they've started to dominate a massive portion of the market, they're starting to have negative effects on our public discourse. Whereas the commons, this idea of this public space where we could gather used to be in the real world, it's not just YouTube, it's Twitter, it's Facebook. These platforms are having a serious impact. And we know they are because we constantly hear about Russia interfering in our elections. So if that's true, then we need protections for U.S. citizens to allow them to speak. Otherwise, their rights will be stripped away by billionaires who don't know or care about them.
What kind of regulation? What kind of protections, I guess?
That is a big challenge, right? With YouTube, it's particularly challenging because whether or not YouTube promotes your content is very different from whether or not they host your content and allow people to find it. So on the right side of YouTube, you have that recommendation bar. That to me seems more like a privilege, not a right. But there are a lot of people who have broken no rules who find their channels put in what's called a limited state, meaning that people can't even search for it anymore, which effectively removes it. So that's a suppression of someone's speech.
And you see that as a problem. You see that as a problem with a company like YouTube doing that, not putting someone.
Yep.
Really, not promoting,
well,
not amplifying alt-right like hate speech. You see that? I want to make sure that's a human right. That's a First Amendment right to Tim Pool.
No, not at all. And neither is monetization, right? So this gets into the heart of regulation as well, in the sense that YouTube acts as an advertising agency, as a marketing agency, and a hosting service, all rolled up into one. And if you run afoul of any one of these different aspects of the company, you lose access to everything. Which is where, there's a potential argument for breaking up YouTube into various forms, or guaranteeing the right to certain limitations on what YouTube can or can't do. So if they're going to suppress legal speech in this country based on some international standard that doesn't apply to Americans, but there's nowhere else for Americans to go, and they are dominating the conversation, then some kind of restriction has to guarantee speech.
Well, some of this, though, obviously, right, is sort of self-serving. Recently, you did a video, I want to make sure, on Pinterest, and it got removed. I know you got really upset about that. Can you explain that to people who don't know? You did a video on Pinterest, sort of making some accusations, and I think you doxed somebody, and it was removed, and you were mad.
Yeah, and this is probably the perfect example of why any kind of restrictions on speech, particularly when they say it's hate speech, is so insidious. I did a video commenting on publicly available information. But because the story was damaging to this massive billion-dollar corporation, apparently, this is my understanding, right? So this is where we're at so far in the story. I haven't reported this yet, but it seems like a legal firm filed a privacy complaint, and YouTube just takes the content down, even though it's public. So this is a massive legal firm with probably hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe tens of millions, I don't know, getting journalism taken down by lying, essentially, or putting pressure on YouTube.
And to be clear, for people who don't know, this information was made public by James O'Keefe, so they can check the sources for themselves.
Right. So James O'Keefe does an expose, and he publishes.
let's call it that. Yeah.
Well, yeah. You don't have to like the guy, but he had a whistleblower on the record. And if you don't want to trust James, you can trust the guy who did get fired from Pinterest saying this happened. Okay. Now, if you want to argue that journalism violates someone's privacy, I think you're wrong. But James O'Keefe did publish someone's name. I still think James O'Keefe is in the right on that issue. But then it gets even crazier when I'm simply commenting on what everyone already knows, and they still say you cannot do that. Now you have massive unaccountable companies, like no one elected Pinterest to determine what beliefs you're allowed to have, but they are suppressing information. And once people found out, because regulation is coming, Pinterest then acts in the interest, or I should say YouTube and these other platforms, because even Twitter took down James O'Keefe's videos. They're protecting each other as far as I'm concerned, because they know regulation is going to be bad for their bottom dollar.
That's the key there, is as far as, I want to make sure people understand, as far as Tim Pool is concerned. Let me ask you this. I know you say that you're more moderate left, but you just mentioned, James O'Keefe and Pinterest, and obviously you defended Stephen Crowder with the Carlos Mazzah conflict. Do you ever worry you're on the wrong side of history because you're consistently siding with and defending bullies? Does that ever occur to you?
But I've made several videos in the past several weeks defending the left. I made a video yesterday defending an anti-fascist who was suspended from Twitter because his book had KKK heads on it. So I'll tell you what happens. People like you, Skyler, only ever watch the videos that are supporting the speech of people you don't like, and you ignore it when I make videos defending the speech of people on your side because it's not sensational enough for you.
Well, I have to be honest, I'm not super familiar with your videos. It doesn't show up in my suggested feed.
That's probably true too.
Yeah. So I don't listen. I haven't seen all of your videos, but if you say that, I'll take your word for it.
And I'll tell you what's really funny is this author who got suspended from Twitter, which he shouldn't have because of his book cover, starts ragging on me when he's complaining about it. I defended the guy, so I'll tell you what, man, I'm going to defend speech. I defended flag burning, right? My principles are where they lie. It doesn't matter. I don't, in fact, I find myself more likely to agree with the speech of people who are moderate left. I think there's a lot of people way too far to the left than I would a conservative. But the issue is it's obvious. Well, then first they come for you, then they come for me.
Well, then why would you defend someone like a Stephen Crowder, right? With a smaller guy like Carlos Mazzah and he had less than 100,000 followers. And that's a clear example of Crowder obviously had violated terms of service by making hateful content, which YouTube said, and a big channel with almost 4 million subscribers going after a lifelong LGBTQ advocate. How's that not a prime example of
Well,
bullying?
first, YouTube said Steven didn't break any rules.
Well,
So
they demonetized him, so
they did, right? And because he
tomato.
caused, in their view, they said it was harmful to the community. But here's the bigger problem: would you prefer it if Carlos Maza was banned from Twitter and YouTube? Is that what you're advocating for? Because Carlos Maza has repeatedly done the exact same thing. In fact, one of the big problems is, first of all, I understand comedy, right? I'm a big fan of George Carlin, and George Carlin he had this bit in the early 90s where he used every racial slur in the book and said, it's not the words, it's the person behind the words you've got to be worried about. And the reason why that's so important is that Carlos Maza used those words on himself. If we held everyone to the same standard, Carlos Maza would have been banned from YouTube way before Steven Crowder ever got to the point of criticizing him.
Well, no. That's a false equivalency. If we're going to use George Carlin's example, it would be, it's the person behind them. It's just like it's not the same for a black person to reappropriate the N-word versus a white person calling them that. Carlos Maza can use those words. Someone like Stephen Crowder, he was using it clearly in a derogatory way. It's the person who is not an ally.
So you agree with George Carlin's position on it, that it's the person behind it and the intent, the context that matters. Context is what's important, right?
Yes, context, and of course the context is problematic when you see that someone like Stephen Crowder clearly violated guidelines and it was harassing content.
Well, if you agree that the context is relevant, then we're talking about a comedian who's describing a person the way they describe themselves. And what's really important here is because this is a common tactic we see from activists like Carlos Maza, interestingly, who repeatedly has called for various people to be taken down. You know that Carlos Maza, this is a screenshot, so I haven't confirmed this, but apparently he referred to gay men as ghouls, like in an absolutely derogatory way. So if we're gonna take him at his word, and that's how he describes people, then I don't trust him when he describes himself that it's supposed to be in jest or reappropriating the language. It shouldn't matter. If back to the point, because I kind of derailed, these activists, what they've done with Crowder is they've gone through 2 years worth of content and snipped together all of these out of context times he said certain things. But YouTube realized when you watch the full segment, it was a passing moment and it wasn't targeting Carlos specifically based on those traits. It was just him talking about something and then mentioning the identity of Maza. By all means, you can be mad at Crowder for doing that. I'm willing to listen to your opinion. But we go back and look at what Carlos Maza is saying, throw milkshakes at people. And he actually, and again, I want to clarify, I didn't confirm this tweet yet, but it's going around now because Maza has repeatedly referred to various minorities.
Seems like there's a lot of that in your content, if I may say, a lot of unconfirmed screenshots and tweets. But, listen, No,
that's actually not true at all.
No.
I maybe less than.
I would say agree to disagree, but only if there was even a slight chance that I was incorrect, which we know is not the case here.
You are, yeah, because I actually use NewsGuard, which is a third-party rating agency I actually have great disagreements with, but I use it on purpose as a check on my own personal bias. So yes, everything I use is confirmed.
I'm not as familiar with NewsGuard. I tend to reference Vice and Vox quite a bit. Let me ask you.
I was the founding member of Vice News, so you probably trust me in that regard, right?
No, well, good for you. Where are you? You're not working for them anymore, I guess, right? No, we can revisit. Let's circle back to that. Maybe we can do a shallow dive because that seems about where we're going here. Let me ask you this though. Do you understand that freedom of speech, right? We're talking about people who've taken advantage of the systems that be and the inherent balances they're in, right? People who've been in positions of power and oppression, and people who have been in historically positions of power and oppression. People like yourself, people like Stephen Crowder, people like those in the alt-right, people like those who we see at.
What do you mean by people like me?
Well, people like white males in the United States.
So wait. Are you making a derogatory comment on my mixed race heritage? Is that what you mean by people like you?
Oh, yeah, that's right. I'm sorry. This is the part where you pull out the trump card that you have. That somewhere in your 23andMe, there's enough Korean for me to give you a pass and consider you
Korean mom.
Well, listen. Let's be honest. That the Koreans haven't been the same kind of oppressed class in the United States. What we agree is LGBTQ, as trans people in the United States today, or black people given slavery. Have Koreans been slaves in the United States? Have they been burned at the stake for being witches?
Well, I will give you. I do recognize that certain communities face, different and sometimes worse prejudices for sure. How do we weigh that is the bigger challenge. I mean, my family dealt with, with World War II and the racism towards the Japanese, that affected every Southeast Asian person, including my family, because most people couldn't tell the difference.
So now you're saying all Asians are the same. So
I'm saying racist Americans couldn't tell the difference and would take it out on my family 100% yes. Not all Americans are racist. I think it was, throughout our history, we've had serious problems with racism. But I'll tell you what, America has probably done the best job of getting rid of it and protecting marginalized groups. I reflect on this fairly often because I recognize miscegenation was only made nationally legal in like 1967. There are still countries where I personally can't go because of my family, and it's dangerous. Yeah. So America, I feel safe and free. That's why I really do appreciate what this country does.
Well, listen, I think if people look at you, they wouldn't racist Americans, as you put it, wouldn't necessarily consider you. That's rich coming from someone who lines up with the alt-right on a regular basis. But then let's get to this. Sure. Let's assume that's correct. Listen, do you not see that inherently people who've benefited from the systems of imbalanced powers that be, them using their speech in a way that is harassing, that is intimidating, in ways that make marginalized people feel unsafe, that makes speech less free when you look at the entire...
What does that mean, less free?
It means people in marginalized classes are afraid to speak out because people in systems of power, people in positions of power are speaking against them. And that's why there does need to be a balance when it comes to what speech is permissible.
Everybody feels that way about everything. There are white working class people who are scared to speak up for what they see as, as oppression. There are white men who feel the same way. Now, certainly I understand systemic racism, and I've done documentaries about it. But you can't target a poor individual because of the color of their skin, no matter what the color of their skin is. So, if you want to look at a racial group as a monolith, well, I think that's particularly racist, especially when you yourself just accused me of being a white male, not realizing I've had white supremacists attack me and my family. And that's something I get a lot from people on the left.
Now, why would they attack you and your white supremacists?
Because my family is mixed race.
Really?
So they vandalized my family's home. They threw bricks through the window because they don't like the fact that an Asian woman was race mixing with a white man. They didn't. And then I grow up having that as a part of my family history, being told by my grandparents how they had to flee from state to state because of these laws. And what do I get finally when I'm older? You know what I look at? I thought to myself, when I'm older and America does away with this racism, we continually do a better job, I will truly be free. Instead, what I end up finding is a regressive left-wing activist group that refuses to judge me based on the content of my character and repeatedly points the finger at me and calls me a white male, ignoring the fact that I have been oppressed and these white, wealthy, liberal progressives haven't. They don't care, though.
Well, no, listen, I'm not ignoring the fact that you've been oppressed. I'm simply saying that I find it ironic that you would encourage the systems that be to continue unfettered to oppress others. It would seem that you would want to help those who would be in the same situation that your family found yourself in. But let me ask you, say fringe minority leftists, would the UK, would Canada, Sweden, I mean, all these places have some limitations on speech outside of the United States. They have speech laws. They have hate speech laws. And it doesn't seem as though it's a problem there. It doesn't infringe on people's rights. Do we not think that there's an appropriate level of regulation as it pertains to speech as we see everywhere else in the world?
Well, there's certainly been problems. But let me ask you a question. Would you be upset if you made a joke and got arrested?
Well, depends
let's say you made a joke about the alt-right and you said, these alt-right guys, somebody should throw a brick or a milkshake at them. Would you be upset if they came and arrested you for saying that?
Well, no, because those are white males in positions of power, so that's different. I'm speaking truth to power, not speaking from a position of power to oppress somebody.
Well, I'm talking, right, but you specifically, you would be okay if you're white, so you'd be fine if they came and arrested you because you're a white male?
Well, I'm saying there was no scenario under which that would happen because of the context.
You're actually right. It's kind of funny. Like when we see Count Dankula make a joke with his dog and he gets arrested for it. And then you have this other British woman comedian tell people their milkshakes are pathetic and they should throw battery acid instead. And in that regard, she gets defended by the press. So you're right, there's a double standard.
Well, hold on a second. I think you're not being honest. The guy taught, right, a dog to do a Nazi salute. Right, a very hateful gesture that comes loaded with all kinds of historical and contextual baggage, to use your argument from George Carlin before. I think you need to be honest. Yeah, I think that there are lines in teaching a dog to do a gesture that could cause serious harm to other individuals.
Like what harm?
Well, people who are survivors from that era in time, from World War II, like you talked about with your parents. I don't think they'd be very happy to see a concentration
Actually, no.
camp.
My parents appreciate the humor. They do, and I have numerous examples of them. I'm a product of my parents, and I'll tell you exactly why free speech was so important to them. When my grandparents wanted to be free to love who they love, they had to fight against an oppressive culture that didn't want them to speak up about why they should be allowed to live together and marry and have children. If we continued on a path of some arbitrary, force determining what is or isn't offensive, then you will never see the advancement of civil rights again, because society as a whole, the moral majority, will always stop people from speaking out over what's right. So I learned that firsthand. And what I see today is I don't see modern conservatives like, Crowder attacking me based on my race. They're judging me based on the content of my character, someone I can choose to be as opposed to something I can't change. But it's these countries like Sweden and the UK that are choosing not to ask me what to do better, but saying you look a certain way, therefore we're going to judge you. And that is contrary to the dream of Martin Luther King Jr., at least in my understanding of what he said. So I don't understand how what you're saying aligns with the dream of Dr. King. I don't.
Well,
it seems like you oppose him.
No, it's a bit. Oh, okay. Clever wordplay. All right. We see this happen a lot, right? With Dave Rubin. I'm a classical liberal, and then you invoke something and ignore, Strom Thurmond, Southern Strategy, Southern Strategy. Google it, right? Okay. But let me go back to this here. What does it benefit people to have a dog do a Nazi salute, right? There is a scale that you have to weigh. What does it benefit people for someone to make a racist joke or harass a fine young journalist like Mr. Mazza at Vox? What does that benefit?
It diminishes their power. You know that there was a story where a man, it was in World War II era, I think it was in Finland, taught his dog to do the Nazi salute, and the Nazis were furious because it made the Nazis look silly. It belittled them. It took their power away. Ridicule is one of the most powerful ways to take someone's power away, by mocking them and making people laugh and humiliate. That's why, Carlos Mazza said, throw a milkshake. He wants people to be humiliated because he wants to strip them of any kind of prestige.
But it sounds like you have a problem with that. It sounds like I'm hearing
milkshakes at people?
Yeah, it sounds to me like you're saying it's okay for a dog to do a Nazi salute because it's humiliating Nazis, but it's not okay to throw a milkshake at someone because it's
well, because throwing a milkshake can actually cause physical harm. You could in some circumstances actually kill somebody.
Do you have one of those unconfirmed sources for Happy Meal deaths each year with Frosties?
There are people who are allergic to dairy. But I do think that's kind of silly, right? Admittedly, milkshakes are probably the lowest tier of violence you could probably get to outside of like splashing someone with water. But the issue is, if you have the intent to cause harm to somebody, you damage their property, you've crossed that boundary. And admittedly, there's no simple line as to whether or not something. I should say there is something we can clearly use to delineate whether or not you've crossed the line legally, and we have those standards at least in the U.S. Supreme Court rulings. But things really do get challenging when you have a comedian in the UK say, your milkshakes are pathetic, why don't you throw battery acid? Because then you can look to what this woman said about throwing battery acid at somebody. And this is a white woman who said it. She's using her position of power on national radio.
I thought you didn't like identity politics. Well, there it is. But continue. I just listen, bro, I just couldn't let that one go unchecked. But yeah, go ahead.
So I'm actually using that to speak to your understanding of the context of the issue.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Right. If you think that white people in massive positions of power on national radio saying things could be damaging, then you would certainly agree this woman talking about battery acid should be criminal in the same capacity as a guy making his dog do a Nazi salute.
Well, I think it's different. I think it depends on the target, and I think a big part of it is contextually when we're talking about protecting minority classes, the most vulnerable among us, who need protection, versus people who are the ones doing the oppressing, people like Antifa, people like the Trump alt-rightists,
So therein lies the problem. You would judge someone not based on their actions, but their skin color.
No, or their ideas. But I do think that, listen, that goes with the territory in the Western society, that there is a historical context to being particularly a white male that requires a more prudent approach.
So now here comes the big problem that I have, speaks to my politics. There was a time in the United States where absolutely we have oppression, and we still do to a certain extent, right? Racism, sexism, these things are still problems to various degrees. But admittedly, I think people can recognize we've done a really, really good job. In the past, when we had Jim Crow, when we had segregation, these things, You had people who had racist views, who had supremacist views, and over time, through free speech, through free expression, through our Constitution, we've actually done away with these things. And we have now a more free and equal society. The problem is, the argument you're presenting kind of flips that back on its head, where you make the presumption that because someone is, say, mixed race or black or Latino, they're weaker than you. So what happens when you have someone who is mixed, who finally becomes successful? I then get to hear how I'm weaker and less than? That's not something I want to hear. And if you keep telling people they're victims, you're putting them in this mindset. You're telling them you can never change your life, and that's not true. It's absolutely not true.
Well, I could flip that in the same way. And if you don't acknowledge the victimization that has occurred at the hands of the oppressors through the systems that be, you are not helping them. If you simply tell someone who's a minority that, oh, if you work hard enough and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you'll be okay, that's not reality. So I'm simply speaking the truth to them. I want to get back to big tech, but let me ask you a couple other questions here. Kyle Kashuv just had the Harvard application rescinded, and that's been obviously trending everywhere. Have you spoken on that?
I have, actually. And so, look, you'll find I am fairly middle of the road on a lot of these issues. Harvard in the past, it was written about in 2017, I believe, by an Atlantic journalist. Before the Kyle Kashuv thing ever became newsworthy, they have rescinded offers to many people based on past speech and offensive things they've said. So there's a complicated issue there in that it's not about Kyle. It's about, is our society willing to guide and forgive? Because I'll tell you what happens. If you take someone like Kyle, who has apologized and says he will do better, and he's sorry, and is even willing to sit down with the diversity and inclusivity board at Harvard to do better, but you reject him, well, then what can he do? Apologizing didn't work.
Well, maybe he could not use the N-word like 16 times and say he wanted, he hated Jews in private text.
He agreed with you. He completely agreed with you. So you would reject people who would agree with you because at one point when they were young, they did something wrong.
Well, I mean, listen, let's be honest about what he said. So what, you're just a fan of using the N-word repeatedly? Is that what I'm hearing? Is that about right? You're just a fan of...
No, I think it was wrong to do it. I think it was absolutely wrong to do it. But I'll tell you what, you take somebody who did wrong and tell them, we will never forgive you. We will ban you from our platforms. And you know what they'll do? They'll turn around and look for anybody who will accept them. People don't want to be alone. They get scared. But I'll tell you what, I'm willing to forgive. There's a BuzzFeed writer who made a very offensive statement, and I tweeted in support of him when he apologized, because I will always accept an apology. Look, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. But there's a YouTuber named Joey Salads who did a bunch of really offensive racist content. And at first, I smack talked him hard. I was like, I can't believe you would do that. You're fake news. You're racist. But then I realized something. There's a community of people who are actually racist, who would love to take a big YouTuber or a famous Parkland activist and rope them to their side. Don't give them that chance. Accept the apology. Ask them to do better. And if they don't later on, well, 3 strikes and you're out. But if someone like Kyle says it was a mistake and I was a kid, I will say I accept your apology, because we should always be willing to accept forgiveness. And then we can use that opportunity to make a teaching moment and guide people towards being nicer and more productive. But Kyle is already that person as far as I'm concerned. It was 2 years ago, right? It wasn't that long ago. He's only, I think, 18 years old now. But if in the past 2 years he's become a better person, he's realized his mistakes, then we should absolutely accept his apology and give him the chance to show others how to be better. So otherwise, you create the bad, you create the negative consequences.
Oh, me, sorry, forgive me. It sounds to me like you're advocating forgiveness.
I'm talking about not you personally. I'm talking about the people who would refuse to be kind and loving and empathetic. They will create dark pockets.
Well, kind of like your attitude toward Pinterest and Vox, sounds like.
In what? Well, those are big corporations, but what did you mean by that?
Well, I'm not hearing you be very compassionate or forgiving of them. It seems like you...
No, they've doubled down. They've refused to accept responsibility for their actions. They've refused to accept that they hold massive disproportionate power over individuals. Vox is backed to the tune of 200+ million by NBC as well as many others. They have massive institutional power. They have way more subscribers than Steven Crowder did. Admittedly, I think when you look at Vox, the Vox Crowder thing, it is a battle of the titans. I wouldn't call Crowder an impoverished, poor, oppressed minority by no means. He's very powerful, but it's definitely not an issue of Crowder oppressing this poor Carlos Maza. Carlos Maza wielded the force of NBC News, a massive. How old is NBC? NBC's massive corporation with international power. He's wielding that and all of these other media outlets that rallied to his side to come down on somebody else, while at the same time not abiding by his own principles, using offensive slurs, referring to various groups in disparaging ways, and even encouraging people to be violent. So if Vox came out and said, we recognize these things Carlos did was wrong and we accept it, I would accept their apology 100%, like I did for BuzzFeed. That BuzzFeed writer posted an offensive tweet. He apologized for it. And people didn't want me to accept his apology, but I will always give someone a chance to do better. The same is true for Sarah Jong, but her apology was I mean, she has immediately doubled down after the fact, right? Sarah Jong's the one from the New York Times who for years was posting racist content, finally apologizes saying, I was using the language of my oppressor, but then goes right back to using similar language and attacking people. So listen, I will accept your apology, but if it's insincere and you double down, then you're not going to get any special favors from me.
Well, I'll be sure to let everyone know from a minority oppressed class that they need to apologize to Tim Pool before we can allow them a place in the public square. To go back to big tech here, you just mentioned NBC, New York Times. So let me ask you this as a comparison. Would you support NBC or New York Times being forced through regulation to allow any voice on their platform, like a Stephen Crowder or whoever, a Gavin McInnes or yourself? Do you believe that they should be required to allow everyone who wants to, for example, publish a piece in the New York Times?
Right. Now we're getting to the publish versus platform argument. If NBC is acting in the capacity of a publisher, they actually do have some restrictions and regulations on when to allow people to appear and when not, particularly in dealing with elections. That I can understand. But if NBC has an editorial choice and a finite amount of space, I totally get it. Twitter tells everybody it's a service for you to share your ideas, but now they act specifically as an editorial service. And look, you want to argue about Twitter being a platform or a publisher. Facebook has gone both ways, arguing in court they're both a publisher and then later on they're a platform because they want the protections, and they also want the benefits of both sides. But Pinterest goes one step beyond in that they absolutely have an editorial guideline on what is or isn't acceptable. They've determined that a pro-life website is fake news. Okay, that's an editorial position, right? Pinterest doesn't have a legal authority over what is true or not.
No, but they do, just like YouTube. They do have guidelines that one signs onto when using that platform, which reserves them the right to get rid of anybody. Except
YouTube doesn't actually get rid of people they deem to be fake news. They actually have some kind of like algorithmic issues. And that's where we get back to the promotion not being a right, but a privilege. But what they'll do is they'll put a Wikipedia link underneath it. They'll let your speech stay up. I do think it becomes problematic when they put people's videos into what they call a limited state, because that's actually suppressing someone's speech. If you're dominating the market, if you have a disproportionate amount of control, inadvertently or otherwise, over public policy, public discourse, well, then there's got to be some protections of that speech. But to the point of Pinterest behind the scenes, we learned, absolutely has an editorial position, in which case they are not a platform and they're liable for the libel on their platform. So I think what we need to see is, maybe we'll see it, maybe we won't, someone needs to actually just sue Pinterest for what one of their users did and argue in court they've given up their 230 protections when they decided to implement an editorial policy.
Well, that was going to be my last question, because we do have to get going here. In a perfect world, how would the great Tim Pool deal with this? What would you like to see happen with these big tech companies? I'm still not seeing the consistency, for example, in the application toward, let's say, a bakery or like the New York Times, these publishers in big tech. It seems inconsistent. So clarify for me and people who are listening, how would you deal in a perfect world?
I actually do fall into the camp where I believe the bakery thing is complicated. Talking about the bakery, I believe in Colorado with the gay wedding, that's a complicated issue because you have a single baker who was asked to produce a custom message on a cake he didn't want to do, but he did. He did say he would service the couple, just not with a custom cake, and that falls into a similar First Amendment argument that Twitter has. Twitter says we have a First Amendment right to not publish speech we don't agree with. I actually do agree with that, up until you look at the scale of the two businesses. A single baker making a cake is not going to impact national or international politics. Twitter is. So Twitter's grown to a point now where the president is on the platform. Right? If Donald Trump was hiding in the back of the bakery and the only way you could ever hear what he had to say was getting in the bakery, I think we'd have a problem there. The president's on Twitter. The president isn't on these other platforms talking about his plans and his policies. And so we've actually had court decisions that he is creating public forums. Well, if that's true, then we shouldn't allow a massive multinational private entity the right to bar American citizens from the speech of the president. But more importantly, Twitter has investors from Saudi Arabia and foreign countries. Do we want Twitter, which has interest from foreign, governments, the ability to censor American speech? I think the answer is no. Look, if a baker doesn't want to bake you a cake, I actually think he probably should. But you can absolutely call up another number and find another baker within a mile or two. Do I think it's right? It's a complicated question. But there's only one Twitter, right? There are alternatives. There are smaller platforms, but the president isn't on those platforms. So where do I go to engage in my civic discourse and try and influence politicians? Well, it's going to be Twitter. But if Jack Dorsey, if Vijaya Gadde and these other executives at Twitter, including foreign investors, have a different opinion outside of the legal confines of the U.S., we've got a serious problem in that they will absolutely allow Russians to use the platform so long as they fall within their rules and manipulate our policy and our public discourse. But American citizens who want to challenge those opinions are being restricted. Yeah, that can't fly. That can't.
I notice a trend. I notice when it comes to someone doing the Nazi salute, or Kyle Kashuv using the N-word, or Stephen Crowder harassing Carlos Mazzaz, a minority, all of a sudden these issues are more complicated. But then when it comes to a clear example of oppression, you seem to be a little more simplistically minded. So
like what's a clear
let me return this just to the final question, because listen, I don't have the entire day. That's Tim Cast on YouTube, where ironically they haven't removed you, so they must not be as authoritarian as you talk about. What in a perfect world, Tim Pool's world, what would you do? If you can't summarize this right in a paragraph for people, not a soliloquy this time, if you can't summarize this in a couple of phrases for people who are watching, what would you do with Big Tech?
I honestly don't know. I'm not the smartest person in the world, but I can offer some ideas. Protecting the right to legal speech. That means if you say something on the platform that falls within the confines of the law, it should remain up under certain caveats, right? It is a big challenge. A lot of people will say if it's legal speech, it's protected. I agree. However, I have no problem with Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, etc., taking someone down who directly incites violence, who directly sends a threat. Those things are violations of the law and can be removed without a court order, in my opinion. For the most part, though, if we're going to have the commons, if we're going to allow people to partake in democracy, then they need access to massive tech platforms without them being publishers. Otherwise, random publishers, break them up, something needs to be done, and we need to sit down and go over what the future is going to look like with politicians as well as the tech industry. But the tech industry is flaunting the rules as far as I'm concerned, and something needs to be done about it.
All right. Okay. Well, listen, I don't agree. I appreciate you taking the time. That's youtube.com/TimCast. Tim Pool, thank you for being here. Let us know what you think in the comment section as to whether you are convinced. Thank you, Mr. Pool.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Are we good? You can just slam dunk him.
Devil's Advocate.
With Skyler Turden.
If you enjoyed this Devil's Advocate with me, your host, Skyler Turden, click one of these videos playing in a box. There are more installments, including with John Stossel, Jordan Peterson, and you can subscribe or hit the notification bell to help with the suggested feed in YouTube and the algorithms with people over there who are doing the Lord's work at Big Tech.